My name is Mary Payne, and I am 71 years old. Today, I want to share with you the story of how I survived hell and found heaven on the other side. It's a story that begins in a small yellow house on Maple Street in Riverdale, Kentucky, where the scent of my mother's apple pie once masked the sound of my screams, and where the wooden broom in our kitchen closet became the instrument of my torture. The abuse didn't start gradually, like a slow poison seeping into my life. It exploded into my existence on my 8th birthday, March 15th, 1960, like a tornado that destroyed everything in its path and left nothing but devastation behind. But to understand how I survived, you need to understand exactly what I survived. I remember that day with crystal clarity, because it was the day my childhood died and my nightmare began. I had been playing in our small backyard, chasing monarch butterflies among the apple trees my father had planted the year before. The sun was warm on my face, and I felt invincible in my new pink dress, with tiny white flowers, a birthday gift from my grandmother Ruth, who lived 3 towns over in Louisville. Our house sat at the end of Maple Street, surrounded by a white picket fence that my father painted every spring. From the outside, it looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, the perfect American home, with its cheerful yellow siding, green shutters, and wraparound porch where my mother would sit in her rocking chair shelling peas or mending clothes. The apple orchard behind our house consisted of 12 trees that produced the sweetest fruit in the county. My father, James Payne, took great pride in those trees. He would spend hours pruning them, talking to them like they were his children. Ironically, he showed more tenderness to those apple trees than he ever showed to his actual children. Mary Elizabeth Payne, get in this house right now. My father's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade, sharp and commanding in a way that made my stomach drop with sudden fear. I ran inside, my heart still light with birthday joy, my new patent leather shoes clicking on the hardwood floors my mother polished every Saturday morning. Yes, Daddy. He stood in the kitchen, holding the old wooden broom we used to sweep the back porch. It was a simple thing, worn smooth from years of use with natural bristles that had been trimmed short from constant sweeping. But something was wrong. His eyes, normally a soft brown that crinkled when he smiled, had turned black with a rage I had never seen before. Not even when Tommy had broken his favorite coffee mug the previous month. My father was a big man, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders from his work at the Riverside manufacturing plant. He had thick black hair that he combed straight back with pomade and calloused hands that usually handled machinery, but were now gripping the broom handle with white knuckles. Your mother tells me you've been talking back to her. Is that true? I looked at my mother, confused, and growing more frightened by the second. She stood by the kitchen sink, her auburn hair perfectly curled, despite the humid March afternoon, wearing her favorite blue dress with tiny white flowers that matched my birthday dress. She had planned that detail, I realized later. We were supposed to look like a happy mother-daughter pair for the birthday photos that were never taken. Patricia Payne was a beautiful woman, the kind of beauty that made other mothers jealous at church socials. She had green eyes that could sparkle with warmth or freeze with coldness depending on her mood. Today, those eyes wouldn't meet mine. I don't think I talked back, Daddy. We were just discussing my chores for next week, and I asked if I could— Don't you lie to me! His voice exploded, filling our small kitchen and making the dishes in the cabinet rattle. Before I could react, he grabbed my arm with one massive hand and dragged me toward the basement stairs. His grip was so tight that it left bruises in the shape of his fingers, bruises that would fade long before I understood their significance. 8 years old and already becoming a disobedient little brat. Well, I'll teach you respect. I'll teach you exactly what happens to little girls who don't know their place. The basement was a musty, dark space that smelled of damp earth and my mother's canning supplies. Mason jars filled with peaches, green beans, and pickled beets lined wooden shelves that my father had built himself. There was an old washing machine in one corner and a workbench covered with tools in another. In the center of the room was a braided rug that my grandmother had made, surrounded by storage boxes filled with Christmas decorations and old clothes. What happened next in that basement changed me forever, stealing not just my innocence, but my basic trust in the adults who were supposed to protect me. My father forced me to remove my birthday dress, the beautiful pink dress with white flowers that I had put on with such joy that morning. Then he used the broom handle in ways that no child should ever experience, pushing it into my small body, causing pain so intense that I vomited on my grandmother's braided rug. The physical agony was unbearable, like being torn apart from the inside, but the emotional devastation was even worse. This was my father, the man who was supposed to protect me from monsters, and he had become the monster himself. The wooden handle was rough and splintered in places, and I could feel it tearing my skin as he pushed it deeper. I screamed until my voice gave out, begging him to stop, promising I would never talk back again, that I would be good, that I would do anything he wanted if he would just stop hurting me. But he didn't stop. He continued his assault while telling me in a calm, conversational voice that this was what fathers did to teach their daughters respect. That good daughters learned to accept their punishment without complaint. That if I told anyone about our special lessons, something much worse would happen to my little brother Tommy. If you tell anyone about this, he whispered afterward as I lay curled on the cold concrete floor in a pool of my own blood, I'll make sure you never see another birthday, and then I'll start teaching Tommy the same lessons. Do you understand me? I nodded, unable to speak through my tears, and shock unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened to me. When we went back upstairs, my mother was setting the table for my birthday dinner as if nothing had happened. The kitchen smelled like pot roast and fresh bread, normal dinner smells that would forever after make me feel nauseated. She glanced at me once I saw something flicker in her green eyes, something that might have been sympathy or guilt, but then she turned away and continued arranging the silverware with precise, careful movements. Go wash up, Mary. We're having your favorite pot roast with carrots and potatoes, and I made chocolate cake for dessert. I climbed the stairs to the bathroom on shaking legs each step, sending fresh waves of pain through my small body. In the mirror above the sink, I looked like a different child than the one who had been chasing butterflies an hour earlier. My face was pale and streaked with tears, my hair was disheveled, and my eyes held a knowledge that no 8-year-old should possess. That night, we sat around our dinner table, the same table where we had shared countless family meals, and pretended that everything was normal. My father carved the roast with the same hands that had just tortured me. My mother served vegetables and made pleasant conversation about the weather and the neighbor's new baby. Tommy, only 3 years old, chattered happily about the butterfly he had seen in the garden. And I sat there in silence, feeling the blood drying on my legs under my clean dress, learning my first lesson in the terrible art of keeping secrets. Over the next 3 years, the abuse became a twisted routine that governed our household like a cruel metronome. But my father was cunning. He varied his methods to keep me terrified and off balance, always finding new ways to inflict maximum pain while leaving minimal visible evidence. The basement became his preferred location during the winter months when neighbors were less likely to be outside and hear any sounds. But in the summer, he would take me to the old shed behind our apple orchard, a small building where he stored lawn equipment and garden tools. The shed had no windows and thick wooden walls that muffled sound. He would lock the door from the inside and hang the key on a nail just out of my reach, while he did things to me that I still struggle to describe even now, 50 years later. Sometimes it was the broom handle thrust into my body, until I bled the rough wood scraping and tearing delicate tissues that were never meant to endure such brutality. Other times, he would combine it with his thick leather belt, wrapping the belt around my throat while he hurt me in other ways, cutting off my air supply until I nearly lost consciousness, then loosening it just enough to let me breathe before tightening it again. He developed an elaborate system of punishments that he claimed were designed to teach me different lessons. If I spilled something at dinner or forgot to complete a chore, it would be 5 minutes with the broom handle. If I talked back to my mother or came home late from school, it would be 10 minutes with both the broom and the belt. If I cried too loudly during the abuse, he would add additional time to my punishment. "Tears show weakness, Mary," he would say in that calm, conversational voice that haunts my dreams to this day. "Weak little girls grow up to be worthless women. I'm helping you become strong." The worst incidents involved his threats to hurt Tommy. My little brother was a sunny child with our father's dark hair and our mother's green eyes, completely oblivious to the horror that was unfolding in his own home. He worshipped our father, running to greet him every evening when he came home from work, begging for piggyback rides and stories. "You make one sound," my father would hiss during these sessions, "and little Tommy gets the same treatment. Is that what you want, Mary? Do you want me to teach your baby brother how to be strong too?" The threat was more effective than any physical restraint could have been. I would bite my own hand until it bled, rather than make a sound that might bring Tommy into this nightmare. As I grew older, my father became more creative and more violent. When I turned 10, he introduced new elements to my torture. He would heat the metal end of a poker in our fireplace and use it to brand small marks on parts of my body where they wouldn't be visible when I wore clothes. He would force me to drink vinegar until I vomited, then make me clean up the mess while he continued his assault. He also began taking photographs, Polaroid pictures that he kept in a locked box in his bedroom. "Insurance," he called them, "in case you ever get any ideas about telling tales to outsiders." My mother, Patricia Payne, played her role in this domestic theater with a skill that still amazes me. In public, she was the devoted wife and loving mother, the kind of woman other mothers admired and envied. At church socials, she would brag about how well-behaved I was, how mature and responsible for my age. "Mary is such an angel," she would tell Mrs. Henderson from down the street, her voice filled with maternal pride. "Never gives us a moment's trouble. She's always so quiet and helpful around the house." At the grocery store, she would introduce me to acquaintances as her little helper, putting her arm around my shoulders in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like a cage. She would buy me small treats, a candy bar or a comic book, and make sure other people saw her doing it, creating the image of a caring mother who indulged her daughter. But at home, she became someone else entirely. Cold, distant, and willfully blind to what was happening under her own roof. She would time her errands to coincide with my father's discipline sessions, making sure she wasn't in the house when my screams might disturb her conscience. When she was present during the abuse, which happened more frequently as I got older, she would busy herself with household tasks, ironing clothes, washing dishes, or organizing closets, humming softly under her breath, as if my pain were nothing more than background noise. One evening in November 1963, after a particularly brutal session that left me unable to walk properly for 3 days, I attempted to tell her what Daddy was doing to me. I was 11 by then, old enough to understand that what was happening wasn't normal, despite my father's constant reminders that this is what fathers do to teach their daughters respect. And all good families have private rules that outsiders wouldn't understand. "Mama," I whispered one night as she tucked me into bed, her movements efficient and emotionless. "Daddy has been hurting me in bad ways, with the broom and other things, and he takes pictures and—" She cut me off with a sharp slap across my face, the sound echoing in my small bedroom like a gunshot. "Don't you ever say such wicked things about your father again," she hissed, her voice ice cold and filled with a fury that seemed directed at me rather than at the situation I was describing. "He works 16 hours a day to provide for this family, and all you can do is make up terrible stories. You should be ashamed of yourself, Mary Elizabeth. Ashamed and grateful that you have a father who cares enough to teach you proper behavior." The slap left a red mark on my cheek that lasted for 2 days, and I told people at school that I had fallen off my bicycle. But worse than the physical sting was the realization that I was truly alone in this nightmare. My mother wasn't just failing to protect me. She was actively participating in my destruction. That night, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the normal sounds of our house settling for the night, and I realized that if I was going to survive, I would have to save myself. The only place I felt truly safe was Lincoln Elementary School, specifically in Mrs. Linda Morrison's 5th grade classroom. Mrs. Morrison was different from all the other adults in my life. She actually saw children as human beings worthy of respect and protection, not as objects to be controlled and manipulated. Lincoln Elementary was a beautiful old brick building with tall windows and high ceilings, built in 1925, when people believed that children deserved beautiful spaces for learning. Mrs. Morrison's classroom was on the 2nd floor with windows that looked out over the playground and the hills beyond our small town. She had filled the room with plants, books, and student artwork, creating an environment that felt more like a home than a classroom. Mrs. Morrison herself was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with graying blonde hair that she wore in a neat bun secured with decorative pins. Her blue eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing, and she had a way of making every child feel like the most important person in the room. She wore simple dresses in soft colors, lavender, pale yellow, mint green, and comfortable shoes that allowed her to move quickly around the classroom, helping students who needed extra attention. "Good morning, scholars." She would greet us each day with genuine enthusiasm, her voice carrying across the room and somehow reaching into the darkest corners where frightened children tried to hide. "Today, we're going to learn something that will make you smarter than you were yesterday. Isn't that exciting?" Mrs. Morrison taught us that education was our pathway to freedom, though I don't think she realized how literally I would interpret that lesson. She had grown up during the Great Depression, the daughter of a coal miner, who believed that knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be taken away from you. Children. She would tell us, "Books are magic carpets that can take you anywhere you want to go. They can show you different worlds, different possibilities, different ways of living. Never let anyone convince you that you're stuck where you are." She encouraged us to ask questions about everything, to challenge ideas that didn't make sense, to think for ourselves, rather than simply accepting what adults told us. For a child who had been trained to never question authority, these were revolutionary concepts. Mrs. Morrison also taught us about our rights as human beings. She had a poster on her wall that listed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in language that children could understand. "Every person has the right to be safe," it said. "Every person has the right to be treated with dignity. Every person has the right to ask for help when they need it." I would stare at that poster during math lessons and reading time, memorizing every word, holding on to those rights like lifelines in a storm. It was during a recess in early spring of 1964 that Mrs. Morrison first noticed something was wrong. I had been sitting alone under the old oak tree in the corner of the playground, writing in a journal she had given me to practice my penmanship. While other children played kickball and jumped rope, I found solace in putting words on paper, creating stories where brave princesses saved themselves from dragons. "Mary," she said, settling down beside me on the grass, her soft voice cutting through the noise of children at play. "I've noticed you seem tired lately. You've lost weight, and you sometimes wince when you sit down. Is everything all right at home?" I looked up at her kind face, at the genuine concern in her blue eyes, and felt something crack inside my chest, a tiny fissure in the wall I had built around my heart to protect myself from hope. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Morrison." I lied, but my voice broke on the words, betraying the truth I was trying to hide. She studied me carefully, taking in details that other adults had missed or chosen to ignore: the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched when anyone moved too quickly, the careful way I positioned myself in chairs to avoid putting pressure on injured areas. "You know, Mary, I grew up in a house where things weren't always fine either. Sometimes adults do things to children that aren't okay, things that hurt them in ways that don't always show on the outside. If that's happening to you, I want you to know that it's not your fault. Children are never responsible for the bad things that adults do to them, and there are people who can help, That conversation planted a seed in my mind, the radical idea that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to live this way forever, that there might be adults in the world who would choose to protect children instead of hurting them. But I wasn't ready to trust that idea yet. I had been trained too well in the consequences of telling family secrets. "Thank you for caring about me, Mrs. Morrison," I said quietly. "But really, everything is fine." She nodded, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. "Mary, I want you to know that you can talk to me about anything at all, and if you ever need help, I will help you. That's a promise." Over the following weeks, Mrs. Morrison began paying closer attention to me. She would find excuses to keep me after class, ostensibly to help with my handwriting or to discuss a book I was reading. But really, she was creating opportunities for me to talk, safe spaces where I might find the courage to tell the truth. She also began teaching lessons that seemed designed specifically for children in my situation. We read stories about brave children who overcame difficult circumstances. We discussed the difference between secrets that protect people and secrets that hurt people. We learned about community helpers, police officers, doctors, social workers who had special jobs to keep children safe. "Sometimes," she told our class one day, "keeping a secret can be the most dangerous thing a person can do. If someone is hurting you and they tell you to keep it secret, that's not a secret you should keep. That's a secret you should tell to a trusted adult who can help make the hurting stop." I felt like she was speaking directly to me, and I began to wonder if she already knew what was happening in my house. The possibility terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. By the time I turned 12 in March 1964, the abuse had escalated to a level that left me physically damaged and emotionally shattered. My father had become bolder in his methods, more violent in his approach, and more creative in his techniques of inflicting maximum pain while maintaining the facade of a normal family. The worst incident happened on a rainy Thursday evening in April, a night that still haunts my dreams more than 50 years later. My mother had gone to visit her sister Margaret in the next town, overtaking Tommy with her for what she claimed would be an overnight visit. She kissed my father goodbye at the door, a performance of wifely affection that made my stomach turn. "Take care of Mary while we're gone," she told him, her voice carrying a meaning that I was only beginning to understand. "Make sure she gets her lessons." I was in my bedroom doing homework when I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs. Each step seemed to echo with impending doom, and I found myself counting them 13 steps to the top of the stairs, then the creak of the floorboard outside my door. "Come here, Mary," he called from the living room where he sat in his brown leather chair, the wooden broom across his lap like a weapon of war. I knew what was coming, but I also knew that resistance would only make it worse. Over the years, I had learned that compliance might earn me a shorter session, might reduce the additional punishments that came with defiance. "Yes, Daddy," I said, walking into the living room on legs that felt like they were made of water. He looked at me for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in my school clothes, my carefully brushed hair, the homework I was still clutching in my trembling hands. "At 12 years old," he said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. "Almost a teenager. Do you know what happens to teenage girls who don't learn their lessons properly when they're young?" I shook my head, afraid to speak. "They become whores and sluts, Mary. They bring shame on their families and end up pregnant and ruined before they're 16. Is that what you want to become?" "No, Daddy," I whispered. "Good. Then you understand why these lessons are necessary. Take off your clothes and go to the basement." What he did to me that night was so brutal, so systematic in its cruelty, that I lost consciousness twice and woke up on the concrete floor in pools of my own blood. He used not just the broom handle, but also tools from his workbench, screwdrivers, pliers, a hammer handle, turning my small body into a canvas for his sadistic creativity. But worse than the physical pain was what he said afterward as I lay broken and bleeding on my grandmother's braided rug. "Your mother knows all about our special time together, Mary. She's known from the very beginning. In fact, she's the one who suggested I use the broom handle, said it would be more effective than my hands or my belt. She told me you needed extra discipline to keep you from becoming a whore like her sister Margaret. So don't go getting any ideas about telling tales at school. She'll just tell them you're a disturbed child who makes up stories for attention." That revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing what little breath I had left in my damaged body. My mother hadn't just been willfully blind, she had been actively complicit in my abuse, possibly even the architect of its most twisted elements. I lay there, on the cold concrete, staring up at the bare bulb that cast harsh shadows on the basement walls, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family had been a lie. There was no one coming to save me. There was no parent who secretly loved me and would eventually find the courage to protect me. There was only me, and if I wanted to survive, I would have to find a way to save myself. The next morning, I could barely walk, let alone sit at my school desk. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through my battered body, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out in pain. During lunch period, Mrs. Morrison asked me to stay behind while the other children went to recess. She closed the classroom door and pulled a chair close to my desk, settling herself so that we were at eye level. "Mary, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Is someone at home hurting you? And I don't mean spanking or normal punishment. I mean hurting you in ways that leave you unable to sit properly, ways that make you afraid to go home at night." I stared at her for a long moment, weighing my father's threats and my mother's betrayal against the possibility of escape that her question represented. Mrs. Morrison's face was kind but serious, and I could see in her eyes that she already knew the answer to her question. "Yes," I whispered, and then louder, my voice gaining strength from the truth. "Yes, Mrs. Morrison, my father is hurting me, with a broom and other things, and my mother knows about it. She helps him plan it." Mrs. Morrison's face went pale, but she didn't look shocked or disbelieving, just deeply sad and determined. "Mary, I want you to tell me everything, and then we're going to make sure it never happens again." Mrs. Morrison listened to my entire story without interruption, taking careful notes in a composition book she pulled from her desk drawer. As I spoke, describing years of systematic abuse in clinical detail, I watched her face cycle through emotions, horror, anger, determination, and something that looked like fierce protectiveness. When I finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing what I had told her and formulating a plan. "Mary," she said finally, "what your father has done to you is not just wrong, it's criminal. He can be arrested and sent to prison for these acts. But to make that happen, we need evidence that will convince the police and the courts." She explained that unfortunately the word of a child against her parents was often not enough to secure a conviction, especially in a small town where my father was known as a hard-working man and my mother was respected in the church community. "We need proof," she said. "Physical evidence that shows what he's been doing to you." I thought about the wooden broom stained with my blood from years of abuse and the photographs my father kept in the locked box in his bedroom. "There's the broom handle," I said quietly. "Even though he cleans it sometimes, there's still blood in the wood grain. And he takes pictures. Polaroid pictures that he keeps in a metal box under his bed." Mrs. Morrison's jaw tightened. "The photographs would be the strongest evidence, but they would also be the most dangerous for you to obtain. The broom might be enough if we can get it to the right people for analysis." She told me about her friend, Dr. Sarah Chen, who worked at the county hospital and had experience with cases involving child abuse. "Dr. Chen can examine you and document your injuries," Mrs. Morrison explained. "Medical evidence combined with the physical evidence from the broom should be enough to build a strong case." "But how do I get the broom without my father noticing?" I asked. Mrs. Morrison thought for a moment. "When does your father work late shifts?" "Wednesday evenings," I said. "He doesn't get home until after midnight." "And your mother?" "She usually goes grocery shopping on Wednesday afternoons while he's sleeping. She takes Tommy with her, and they're gone for about 2 hours. "That gives us a window of opportunity," Mrs. Morrison said. "But Mary, I need you to understand something. Once we take this step, there's no going back. Your life is going to change completely. Are you ready for that? I thought about the alternative years more of abuse, the possibility that Tommy might eventually become a victim too, the certainty that I would never be safe as long as I remained in that house. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm ready. We spent the next few days refining our plan. Mrs. Morrison contacted Dr. Chen and arranged for a medical examination during my lunch period the following week. She also reached out to a social worker named Janet Phillips and a police detective named Robert Hayes, both of whom specialized in cases involving child abuse. She told me on Tuesday afternoon, tomorrow is the day. Are you sure you can do this? I nodded, feeling more determined than I had ever felt in my life. I'm sure. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that it might be the last night I would ever spend in that house. The thought filled me with equal measures of terror and hope. Wednesday, April 22nd, 1964, dawned gray and drizzly-fitting weather for the day that would change my life forever. I sat through my morning classes in a state of nervous excitement, my heart beating so fast that I was sure other people could hear it. During arithmetic, I kept glancing at the clock on the classroom wall, mentally rehearsing every step of my plan. During reading period, I found myself staring at the same page for 20 minutes without absorbing a single word. At lunch, I was too nervous to eat, pushing food around my plate while Mrs. Morrison watched me with concerned eyes. Remember, she whispered as I prepared to leave school. If anything goes wrong, if your father comes home early, or if your mother returns unexpectedly, abandon the plan immediately. Your safety is more important than the evidence. I walked home at my usual pace, trying to appear normal to anyone who might be watching. Mrs. Henderson was working in her garden and waved at me as I passed. Mr. Peterson was washing his car in his driveway and called out a friendly greeting. These ordinary interactions felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life from a great distance. At home, I sat by the living room window and waited, watching the street for any sign of my father's black Ford or my mother's Chevrolet station wagon. At 4:30 sharp, my father's car pulled out of the driveway, heading for the Riverside manufacturing plant, where he worked the evening shift from 5:00 p.m. to 1:00 a.m. I watched until the car disappeared around the corner, then started counting minutes. At 4:45, my mother emerged from the house carrying her purse and shopping list, Tommy trailing behind her with his favorite stuffed elephant. Mary, she called through the screen door. I'm going to Murphy's Market and then to visit Mrs. Coleman about the church bake sale. Watch the house while I'm gone. Don't answer the door for anyone and don't go outside. I waited by the window until I couldn't hear the car engine anymore. Then I moved into action with the precision of a military operation. The broom was in the kitchen closet, exactly where it had been for as long as I could remember. As I wrapped my hands around the smooth wooden handle, I felt a surge of revulsion so strong that I nearly vomited. This piece of wood had been the instrument of my torture for 4 years, the source of pain so intense that I sometimes wished I would die rather than endure it again. But now it would be the key to my freedom. I had prepared an old bedsheet from the linen closet, and I carefully wrapped the broom to avoid contaminating any evidence that might be embedded in the wood. As I worked, I heard every sound in the house with supernatural clarity: the tick of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of floorboards settling. I was tying the sheet around the broom when I heard a car door slam outside. Panic shot through me like electricity, freezing my blood and making my vision blur around the edges. They were back early. Through the kitchen window, I could see my mother's station wagon in the driveway, Tommy climbing out of the back seat. My mother was pulling grocery bags from the trunk, her movements quick and efficient. I quickly finished wrapping the broom and ran toward the back door, but I could already hear my mother's key in the front door lock. There was no time to get outside without being seen. Mary, where are you? I slipped into the pantry, a small closet off the kitchen, where my mother stored canned goods and cleaning supplies. It was barely large enough for my 12-year-old body, but I squeezed inside, clutching the wrapped broom to my chest, my heart hammering so hard that I was sure she would hear it. "Mary Elizabeth Payne, you answer me right now. Why didn't you answer the door when I knocked?" Through the crack under the pantry door, I could see her feet moving around the kitchen, checking rooms, growing more agitated by the minute. "Tommy, did you see your sister when we drove up?" "No, Mama. Maybe she's hiding." "This isn't a game, Thomas." "Mary, if you don't answer me this instant, I'm calling your father at work." The threat of involving my father gave me the courage to act. I carefully set the wrapped broom in the far corner of the pantry, behind a case of mason jars, then quietly opened the door and slipped out. "I'm here, Mama." I called, running to the back door and opening it as if I had just come inside. I was in the backyard picking apples for tomorrow's lunch. My mother's relief seemed genuine, but I could see suspicion in her green eyes. "I knocked on the front door and called for you. Why didn't you answer?" "I didn't hear you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was all the way back by the apple trees." She studied me for a long moment, taking in my appearance, looking for signs of deception. "Well, next time, stay closer to the house. I don't like not knowing where you are." That evening passed with agonizing slowness. During dinner, I kept glancing toward the kitchen closet, terrified that my father would notice the missing broom. But he seemed distracted by something that had happened at work and barely spoke during the meal. After dinner, my mother sent me to do homework while she cleaned up. I sat at my desk, pretending to work on mathematics problems while actually listening to every sound from downstairs. If she discovered the missing broom, if she realized what I had done. But the evening passed without incident. My father went to his night shift as usual, and my mother settled into her evening routine of ironing clothes and listening to radio programs. At midnight, I slipped out of bed and crept downstairs to retrieve the broom from the pantry. I had to get it out of the house before my father's shift ended at 1:00 a.m. Moving like a ghost through my own home, I carried the wrapped broom to the back door and slipped outside into the cool April night. The apple orchard was silver with moonlight casting shadows that looked like sleeping giants. I made my way to the back fence and slipped through the loose board that Tommy and I used as a secret passage to the woods behind our property. Following a path I had walked hundreds of times during happier childhood explorations, I found the old oak tree where I had decided to hide the evidence. I buried the wrapped broom under a pile of fallen leaves beside the massive trunk, marking the spot with a stack of 3 white stones I had collected from our creek. Then I said a silent prayer, the first prayer I had said in months that wasn't a plea for the abuse to stop asking God to help Mrs. Morrison's plan work. Back in the house, I lay in bed listening for the sound of my father's car in the driveway, my heart still racing from the night's adventure. When I finally heard his Ford pull up at 1:15 a.m., I felt a mixture of relief and terror. The first phase of my escape was complete, but tomorrow would bring even greater challenges. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I thought about Mrs. Morrison's words. "Your life is going to change completely." I was ready for that change, ready for whatever came next, as long as it meant freedom from the nightmare that had consumed my childhood. The next morning, Thursday, April 23rd, I woke before my alarm clock, my body vibrating with nervous energy, and the knowledge that today would bring the medical examination that might provide the evidence needed to escape my father's house forever. Mrs. Morrison had arranged everything carefully. During my lunch period, she would drive me to County General Hospital under the pretense of a routine eye examination, a story she had cleared with the school office, and that would explain my absence without raising suspicions. The morning classes passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. During geography, I found myself staring at the map on the wall and imagining all the places I might live once I was free from my father's control. During spelling, I kept glancing at Mrs. Morrison, drawing strength from her calm presence and the knowledge that she believed me enough to risk her career to help me. At 11:45, Mrs. Morrison quietly approached my desk. "Mary, it's time for your appointment." she said in a voice loud enough for other students to hear. "Gather your things and meet me at my car." Her car was a sensible blue sedan with cloth seats and a dashboard covered in educational materials. As we drove through the familiar streets of our small town, Mrs. Morrison talked quietly about what to expect. "Dr. Chen is a very kind woman," she assured me. "She's helped many children in situations like yours, and she understands how frightening this can be. She'll explain everything she's doing and why it's important." County General Hospital was the imposing brick building that sat on a hill overlooking our town. It smelled of disinfectant and floor wax institutional odors that somehow felt cleaner and safer than the familiar scents of my own home. Dr. Sarah Chen was waiting for us in a small examination room decorated with cheerful posters of animals and flowers. She was a petite woman with kind, dark eyes, graying black hair pulled back in a neat bun, and gentle hands that moved with practiced efficiency. "Mary," she said, settling into a chair beside the examination table. "Mrs. Morrison has told me a little about your situation, and I want you to know that nothing you tell me or show me will shock me. I've helped many children who have been hurt by adults who were supposed to protect them. My job is to document what happened to you so that we can make sure you're safe." She explained the examination process in terms I could understand, assuring me that while it might be embarrassing, it wouldn't be painful. She showed me each instrument she would use and explained its purpose. "The most important thing for you to understand," she said, "is that this examination will provide objective evidence of what has been done to you. It will give the authorities proof that can't be dismissed or explained away." The examination itself was thorough and professional. Dr. Chen narrated each step, explaining what she was seeing and how it related to the abuse I had described. Her clinical detachment was somehow comforting. She treated my damaged body as evidence to be documented, rather than as something shameful to be hidden. "Mary," she said gently afterward as I dressed behind a privacy screen, "I can see clear evidence of repeated trauma to your body. The scarring pattern is consistent with penetration by a cylindrical object approximately the size and shape of a broom handle. The age of various injuries suggests that this abuse has been ongoing for several years." She paused and took my hand. "I want you to understand something very important. None of this was your fault. This kind of damage could only have been caused by deliberate systematic abuse. You did nothing to deserve this treatment, and you've shown incredible courage in seeking help." For the first time in years, I felt like someone truly understood what I had endured. Dr. Chen's words gave medical legitimacy to my suffering, transforming it from a shameful secret into documented evidence of criminal behavior. "What happens now?" I asked. I'm going to prepare a detailed medical report with photographs that document your injuries," she explained. "This report will be given to Detective Hayes and the social services team. Combined with the physical evidence from the broom handle, it should provide a strong foundation for criminal charges against your father." As Mrs. Morrison drove me back to school, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of a child wishing for rescue, but the solid, grounded hope of someone who had taken concrete action to change her circumstances. "How do you feel?" Mrs. Morrison asked as we pulled into the school parking lot. "Scared," I answered honestly. "But also relieved. Like maybe this nightmare might actually end." "It will end, Mary," she said with quiet confidence. "It will end soon." Friday morning brought a meeting that would determine my future. Mrs. Morrison had arranged for me to meet with the team of professionals who would handle my case: Detective Robert Hayes, social worker Janet Phillips, and District Attorney James Wheeler. They gathered in Principal Anderson's office during my lunch period, a room that suddenly felt very small with so many adults present. Detective Hayes was a large man with graying hair and sad eyes that told me he had seen too many children like me. Mrs. Phillips was a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and the kind of practical demeanor that suggested she could handle any crisis. Mr. Wheeler was younger than the others, with an intensity that spoke of someone who took child abuse cases personally. "Sure, Mary," Detective Hayes said, settling into a chair that seemed too small for his large frame. "We've reviewed Dr. Chen's medical report and Mrs. Morrison's documentation of your disclosures. What we're going to do is called a controlled intervention." He explained the plan in simple terms. On Monday morning, while my father was at work and my mother was at home with Tommy, Detective Hayes and Mrs. Phillips would visit our house with a search warrant. They would have the medical evidence, the broom handle that I had hidden in the woods, and legal authority to remove me from the home immediately. "What will happen to my father?" I asked. "He'll be arrested when he comes home from work Monday evening," Detective Hayes said matter-of-factly. "Based on Dr. Chen's report and the physical evidence, he'll be charged with multiple counts of aggravated child abuse. Given the severity and duration of the abuse, he's looking at a significant prison sentence." "And my mother?" Mrs. Phillips leaned forward, her expression serious. "That depends on what we discover about her level of involvement. If she knew about the abuse and failed to report it, she could face charges as well. If we determine she actively participated or facilitated the abuse, the charges could be more severe." I thought about my mother's cold reaction when I had tried to tell her about the abuse, about her convenient absences during my father's discipline sessions, about her suggestion that he use the broom handle. "She knew," I said quietly. "She more than knew. She helped him plan it." The adults exchanged grim looks. Mr. Wheeler made notes in a legal pad, his pen scratching across the paper with decisive strokes. "Mary." Mrs. Morrison said, "On Monday you'll stay here at school with me while Detective Hayes and Mrs. Phillips handle everything at your house. By the end of that day, you'll never have to go back to that situation again." "Where will I live?" I asked, suddenly feeling very young despite all my careful planning. "We've contacted your paternal grandmother, Ruth Payne, who lives in Louisville," Mrs. Phillips explained. "She's already agreed to take you in. She seemed horrified when we told her what had been happening and said she had suspected something was wrong during family visits." I remembered Grandma Ruth with a surge of warm feeling. She was a kind woman who smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, who always brought me books when she visited, who had once asked me why I always seemed so sad. I had wanted desperately to tell her the truth, but my father's threats had kept me silent. "She runs a small bakery," Mrs. Phillips continued, "and she's excited about the prospect of having you live with her. She said she's already preparing a bedroom for you and planning to enroll you in a good school in Louisville." "What about Tommy?" I asked, thinking of my little brother, who still believed our father was a hero. "He'll be placed with your mother's sister in Frankfurt temporarily," Detective Hayes said. "The court will decide permanent custody arrangements later, but he's too young to testify about what he might have seen or heard. He'll need counseling to help him understand and process what's been happening in his home." The meeting concluded with final preparations for Monday's intervention. I would retrieve the hidden broom handle Sunday evening and bring it to school Monday morning. Mrs. Morrison would keep it in her locked desk until Detective Hayes arrived to collect it as evidence. As the adults filed out of Principal Anderson's office, Mrs. Morrison stayed behind with me. "Mary," she said, "I want you to understand that what's going to happen Monday will be difficult. There will be confrontation, tears, and anger. Your mother may say things designed to make you feel guilty or to convince you to change your story. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about 4 years of systematic torture, about the threats to hurt Tommy, about my mother's betrayal and complicity. "I'm ready," I said with a conviction that surprised me with its strength. "I've been ready for this my whole life." The weekend passed with surreal normalcy that felt like the calm before a hurricane. Saturday morning, my father worked in his apple orchard, pruning branches and checking for signs of disease in the trees he loved more than his children. My mother cleaned house with her usual methodical efficiency, humming hymns under her breath as she dusted furniture and mopped floors. I helped with weekend chores, folding laundry, setting the table for meals, playing with Tommy in the backyard, all while knowing that these would be the last such activities I would ever perform in this house. Every familiar task felt like a goodbye. Every room held memories that I was both eager to leave behind and strangely reluctant to abandon completely. Sunday afternoon brought the most challenging part of my plan, retrieving the broom handle from its hiding place in the woods. I had to wait for the right moment when both my parents were occupied and unlikely to notice my absence. The opportunity came during my father's usual Sunday nap. He had eaten a large dinner of pot roast and potatoes, then settled into his leather chair with the newspaper. Within 30 minutes, he was snoring softly, his head tilted back and his mouth slightly open. My mother was in the kitchen preparing food for the week ahead and listening to gospel music on the radio. Mama, I said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. I'm going to take Tommy outside to play. He's been cooped up all day. She glanced up from the bread dough she was kneading flour, dusting her hands and apron. Don't go far from the house, and keep an eye on him near the creek. Tommy was delighted by the prospect of an adventure, chattering excitedly about the fort we might build or the frogs we might catch. His innocent enthusiasm broke my heart. After tomorrow, his world would be turned upside down just as surely as mine would be. Let's play hide and seek, I suggested once we were in the backyard. You hide first and I'll count to 50. Tommy scampered off toward his favorite hiding spot behind the garden shed, and I quickly made my way to the back fence. Slipping through the loose board had become as natural as walking through a door, and within minutes I was kneeling beside the old oak tree where I had buried my evidence. The white stones were exactly where I had left them, and the wrapped broom handle was undisturbed beneath its covering of leaves. I carefully lifted it from its hiding place, checking to make sure the sheet wrapping was still secure, and that no moisture had penetrated to the evidence inside. Mary, Mary, I'm hidden. Tommy's voice carried across the yard, high and sweet with childhood innocence. I'm coming! I called back, quickly making my way back through the fence. I hid the wrapped broom handle in the old doghouse behind our garage, a structure that had been empty since our collie Rusty had died the previous year. It would be safe there overnight, and I could retrieve it early Monday morning on my way to school. Sunday evening dinner was a particularly elaborate affair, as was my mother's custom before the start of a new week. She had prepared fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from her garden, and fresh biscuits with honey butter. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a feast to celebrate and enjoy. But nothing about these circumstances was normal. I sat at our family table, surrounded by people who had shaped my life through violence and complicity, and I felt like I was attending my own funeral. Everything looked the same: the blue-checked tablecloth, my mother's Sunday china, the centerpiece of apple blossoms from our orchard. But everything had changed. My father seemed unusually talkative during dinner, telling stories about his coworkers and making jokes that caused Tommy to giggle with delight. My mother smiled and laughed at appropriate moments, playing her role as the devoted wife and loving mother with practiced skill. And I sat there knowing that within 24 hours, both of them would be in custody, their carefully constructed facades crumbling under the weight of documented evidence and criminal charges. Mary, you're very quiet tonight. My mother observed, her green eyes studying my face with what might have been concern or suspicion. Are you feeling all right? I'm fine, Mama, I replied, forcing myself to meet her gaze. Just thinking about a test I have tomorrow. Well, don't worry too much about it, she said, reaching over to pat my hand with fingers that felt cold despite the warm evening. I'm sure you'll do just fine. You're such a good student. The irony of her maternal concern coming from someone who had actively participated in my abuse for 4 years was almost overwhelming. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing or crying. That night, I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling into sleep. My father's snores rumbled through the thin walls, punctuated by my mother's occasional cough and the whisper of Tommy talking to his stuffed animals in the next room. I tried to memorize these sounds, not because I would miss them, but because I wanted to remember exactly how they felt. The weight of fear and helplessness that had pressed down on me every night for years. Tomorrow, I would sleep somewhere else, somewhere safe, and I never wanted to forget the difference. As dawn approached, painting my bedroom window with pale gray light, I felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. In a few hours, my new life would begin. Monday morning, April 27th, 1964, dawned clear and bright, a beautiful spring day that seemed to mock the gravity of what was about to unfold. I woke before my alarm clock, my body vibrating with nervous energy and the knowledge that this day would change everything forever. I dressed carefully in my best school dress, a navy blue outfit with white collar and cuffs that my grandmother had sent for Christmas. It seemed important to look respectable and credible for what was coming. Breakfast was a surreal experience. My family sat around our kitchen table, as we had thousands of times before, but I felt like I was watching strangers perform a play about normal family life. My father read his newspaper and complained about politics. My mother served oatmeal and reminded Tommy to eat all his breakfast. Tommy chattered about a bird he had seen outside his window, and I sat there knowing that by evening our family, as Tommy knew it, would cease to exist. "I need to leave for school a few minutes early today," I announced as I finished my oatmeal. Mrs. Morrison asked me to help her prepare materials for a special lesson. My mother nodded absently, already focused on the day's housework. My father grunted from behind his newspaper. Tommy was too busy playing with his food to pay attention. I kissed Tommy goodbye, a gesture that felt like tearing my heart in half. He was innocent in all of this, a little boy who would wake up tomorrow in a completely different world, wondering why his family had suddenly disappeared. "Love you, Mary," he said cheerfully, not looking up from the face he was making in his oatmeal with raisins. "I love you too, Tommy," I whispered, meaning it more than he could possibly understand. I retrieved the wrapped broom handle from the doghouse and carefully concealed it in my school satchel. The weight of it seemed enormous, like I was carrying the evidence of my entire childhood's worth of suffering. The walk to school had never felt longer. Every step took me further from the only life I had ever known and closer to an uncertain future. But with each step, I also felt the chains of fear and helplessness loosening around my chest. Mrs. Morrison was waiting for me in her classroom, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by quiet determination. "How are you feeling, Mary?" she asked as I handed her the wrapped broom handle. "Scared," I admitted, "but ready." She locked the evidence in her desk drawer and then settled into the chair beside mine. "Mary, I want you to understand what's going to happen today. At 10:00 a.m., Detective Hayes and Mrs. Phillips will arrive at your house with a search warrant. They'll interview your mother and search for additional evidence. If they find what we expect to find, photographs, other items related to the abuse, they'll place your mother under arrest immediately." I nodded, trying to imagine my mother's face when she realized that her carefully constructed world of secrets and lies was crumbling around her. "Your father will be arrested when he arrives home from work this evening. By tomorrow, both of your parents will be in custody, and you'll be living with your grandmother in Louisville." At 10:15, Mrs. Morrison received a phone call. I watched her face carefully as she listened to the voice on the other end, looking for clues about how the confrontation at my house was proceeding. "I understand," she said finally. "Yes, we'll be ready." She hung up and turned to me with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "They found everything, Mary. The photographs, additional evidence we hadn't even known about, and your mother has made a full confession. She's being transported to the county jail right now." I felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the evidence had been found, sadness for Tommy, who was probably confused, and frightened, and a strange kind of vindication that my years of suffering had finally been acknowledged and documented. "What about Tommy?" "He's with Mrs. Phillips. She'll take him to your Aunt Margaret's house this afternoon. He's scared and confused, but he's safe." The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Other students attended their regular classes while I sat in Mrs. Morrison's room, alternately reading and staring out the window, waiting for news about my father's arrest. At 6:30 p.m., Detective Hayes called with the final update. "James Payne is in custody," Mrs. Morrison relayed after hanging up the phone. "He's been charged with multiple counts of aggravated child abuse, sexual assault, and endangering the welfare of a child. Your mother has been charged as an accessory to child abuse and failure to report." It was over. After 4 years of systematic torture, After months of careful planning, after risking everything on the hope that adults would believe and protect me, it was finally over. I would never again hear my father's key in the door at 6:00 p.m. and feel my stomach clench with terror. I would never again lie in bed listening for his footsteps on the stairs. I would never again endure the pain and humiliation of his lessons. "Are you ready to meet your grandmother?" Mrs. Morrison asked gently. I looked around her classroom one final time, at the posters about human rights, at the books that had taught me about different possibilities at the desk where I had first found the courage to tell the truth about my life. "Yes," I said with quiet confidence. "I'm ready." My father's trial began in August 1964, just as I was settling into my new life with Grandma Ruth in Louisville and preparing to start 7th grade at a school where no one knew my history. The trial brought back all the trauma I was trying to heal from, but it also provided a sense of closure and validation that I desperately needed. The Jefferson County Courthouse was an imposing building with marble columns and high vaulted ceilings that made every voice echo with authority. Judge Harrison presided over the proceedings with stern fairness, his gray hair and lined face suggesting someone who had seen every kind of human behavior and was no longer surprised by anything. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Wheeler, had built what they called an overwhelming case based on Dr. Chen's medical evidence, the physical evidence from the broom handle, and the photographs they had discovered hidden in my father's bedroom. The defense attorney, a thin, nervous man named Robert Clark, faced the impossible task of explaining away years of documented abuse. When I took the witness stand on the second day of trial, the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and community members who had followed the case in the local newspaper. My father sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, looking smaller and less threatening than the monster who had terrorized my childhood. "Mary," Mr. Wheeler said, gently approaching the witness box where I sat with my hands folded in my lap. "I want you to tell the jury about what happened on your 8th birthday." I took a deep breath and began to speak, describing in clinical detail the first incident of abuse and how it had escalated over the following 4 years. I told them about the broom handle, about the additional implements my father had used, about the threats to hurt Tommy if I told anyone. The courtroom was absolutely silent as I spoke. Several jurors were visibly crying, and I saw one woman in the gallery cover her mouth in horror. But I continued speaking, drawing strength from Mrs. Morrison, who sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, and from the knowledge that my words might prevent other children from suffering as I had suffered. When I described the photographs my father had taken documenting his abuse for his own twisted purposes, several jurors looked physically ill. The defense attorney objected repeatedly, claiming the testimony was too graphic and prejudicial. But Judge Harrison overruled each objection. "The jury has the right to hear the full extent of the defendant's criminal behavior," he stated firmly. Cross-examination was brutal, but brief. Mr. Clark tried to suggest that I was an angry child, making up stories to get attention. But Dr. Chen's medical testimony had already established the physical reality of the abuse beyond any reasonable doubt. "Mary," Mr. Clark said, his voice lacking conviction, "isn't it true that you've always had a vivid imagination, that you enjoy writing stories and creating fictional narratives?" "Yes, I like to write stories," I replied calmly. "But this isn't a story. This is what my father did to me for 4 years, and there are photographs to prove it." The most shocking moment of the trial came when my mother testified on the 3rd day. Under oath and facing her own criminal charges, she admitted not only that she had known about the abuse from the beginning, but that she had actively participated in planning and facilitating it. "Why didn't you report it?" Mr. Wheeler asked, his voice filled with barely controlled disgust. My mother's voice was barely a whisper as she answered, "Because I was afraid of him too. And because—" She paused, tears streaming down her face. "Because the same thing happened to me when I was a child. My own father abused me starting when I was 7 years old, and my mother did nothing to stop it. I thought it was just something that happened in families." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My mother had been a victim too, trapped in a cycle of abuse that had been passed down through generations. But instead of breaking that cycle, she had chosen to perpetuate it.
But why facilitate it?
Mr. Wheeler pressed. Why actively help your husband abuse your daughter? Because I thought if I participated, if I made it seem normal and necessary, maybe it wouldn't be as bad for her as it was for me. Her voice broke completely. I know that sounds insane now, but I was trying to protect her in the only way I knew how. I thought if I could control some aspects of it, make it more structured, it would hurt her less. It was a twisted logic born of her own trauma and psychological damage, but it didn't excuse what she had done. The prosecution made that point clearly in their closing arguments. Patricia Payne was indeed a victim of childhood abuse, Mr. Wheeler told the jury. But she made a choice when she became a mother. She chose to repeat the cycle of violence instead of breaking it. She chose to sacrifice her daughter's safety and well-being to protect herself from confronting her husband's criminal behavior. The photographs that had been discovered in my father's bedroom were presented as evidence but not shown to the jury in their original form. Instead, Dr. Chen and Detective Hayes described their contents in clinical terms that were somehow more devastating than the images themselves could have been. The photographs document systematic abuse over a period of several years, Detective Hayes testified. They show the defendant using various implements to torture his daughter, and they show the progression of physical damage to her body over time. In my 20 years as a police officer, I have never seen evidence of child abuse this systematic and prolonged. On September 15, 1964, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict guilty on all counts. My father was sentenced to 15 years in prison for aggravated child abuse, sexual assault, and endangering the welfare of a child. My mother received 5 years probation and was required to undergo intensive psychological counseling. Judge Harrison's sentencing statement was scathing in its condemnation of both my parents. James Payne, he said, looking directly at my father, you have committed crimes against your own child that are so heinous, so systematic, and so prolonged that they shock the conscience of this community. You took a position of trust and authority and used it to inflict unspeakable suffering on a defenseless child. The sentence of this court reflects not only the severity of your crimes, but the need to protect other children from predators like you. He then turned to my mother. Patricia Payne, while your own history of abuse provides context for your actions, it does not excuse them. As a mother, your first duty was to protect your child. Instead, you chose to facilitate her abuse and maintain a conspiracy of silence that prolonged her suffering for years. You will serve 5 years probation, during which you will undergo intensive therapy to address the psychological issues that led to these terrible choices. But the most important outcome of the trial was something I hadn't expected. It opened up a conversation about child abuse that had been hidden in shadows for too long. The local newspaper's coverage of the case prompted other families to come forward with reports of abuse, and several arrests were made in the weeks following my father's conviction. Mrs. Morrison, who had attended every day of the trial, approached me afterward with an idea that would shape the rest of my life. Mary, she said, your courage in speaking out has already helped other children. The prosecutor told me that 5 more families have reported abuse since your story became public. Would you be interested in helping other children who are going through what you went through? The idea scared and excited me at the same time. What would I do? We're starting a support group for child survivors of abuse. You could share your story, let other children know they're not alone, and help them find the courage to speak out. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake, feeling like I was the only child in the world going through such horror. If I could spare even one other child that loneliness and despair, it would be worth facing my fears about public speaking and revisiting painful memories. Yes, I said without hesitation. I want to help. Living with Grandma Ruth was like discovering what a real family was supposed to feel like. Her small apartment above her bakery smelled of cinnamon and vanilla scents that represented safety and comfort, rather than the apple pie aroma that had masked my screams in my childhood home. Grandma Ruth never raised her voice, never hit me, never made me feel like I was walking on eggshells waiting for the next explosion of violence. Instead, she taught me to bake bread and decorate cakes, helped me with my homework at her small kitchen table, and listened to my fears and nightmares without judgment or impatience. "Honey," she told me one evening as we worked together in her bakery kneading dough for the next day's bread, "what happened to you was terrible beyond words, but it doesn't define who you are or limit who you can become. You get to choose your future now, and I'll help you make it as bright and beautiful as you deserve." Her words became my guiding principle as I navigated the difficult teenage years ahead. At Jefferson Middle School, I threw myself into academics and extracurricular activities with the determination of someone who had been given a second chance at life. I joined the debate team, discovering that I had a talent for public speaking and persuasive argument. I wrote for the school newspaper, finding my voice through journalism and storytelling. I volunteered at the local children's hospital, reading to young patients and helping with art therapy programs. Each activity built my confidence and reminded me that I had value beyond my traumatic experiences. I was smart, articulate, and capable of achieving whatever goals I set for myself. I also continued working with the support group that Mrs. Morrison had established, which grew to include 15 children from around the county. Meeting once a week in the basement of First Baptist Church, we shared our stories and supported each other through the long process of healing. One of the children we helped was Marcus, a 10-year-old boy whose stepfather had been burning him with cigarettes and beating him with extension cords. Another was Lisa, a 13-year-old girl whose uncle had been attack her during family gatherings for 3 years. Mary helped me understand that it wasn't my fault. Lisa said during one of our group meetings, her voice growing stronger with each word she spoke. When she told her story at the trial, it gave me the courage to tell mine. Now my uncle is in prison and I don't have to be afraid anymore. These conversations were difficult, but healing. Hearing other children's stories put my own experiences in context and reminded me that I wasn't alone in my suffering. More importantly, watching these children heal and thrive gave my own survival new meaning and purpose. In the spring of 1968, when I was 16 and thriving in my new life, I received an unexpected letter from my mother. She had completed her court-ordered therapy and was living in a supervised facility while continuing her psychological treatment. The letter was written on simple white paper in my mother's careful handwriting, each word chosen with obvious deliberation. "Dear Mary, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not writing to ask for it. I just wanted you to know that I'm getting professional help for the problems that made me fail you so completely. Through therapy, I've learned about something called generational trauma, the way that abuse and violence get passed down through families like a terrible inheritance. The abuse I suffered as a child damaged my ability to protect my own children, but that doesn't excuse the choices I made. My therapist has helped me understand that I wasn't trying to hurt you by participating in your father's abuse. In my damaged mind, I thought I was protecting you by making it more predictable and controlled. I thought if I could influence when and how it happened, it wouldn't be as bad as what happened to me. I know now how wrong and sick that thinking was. I should have protected you. I should have called the police the first time it happened. Instead, I became part of the problem. I've also learned some things about our family history that might help you understand the scope of the damage we were all carrying. Your father had a brother named Michael who died when they were children. The official cause was listed as an accidental drowning, but I now believe Michael took his own life to escape the abuse he was suffering from their father. Your grandfather, Samuel Payne, was apparently as violent and twisted as your father became. The cycle of abuse in that family goes back at least 3 generations that we know of. On my side of the family, the abuse was also generational. My father learned his behavior from his father and so on. When I married your father, I thought I was escaping my family's problems, but I was actually combining 2 streams of inherited damage. I wanted you to know this because understanding the full scope of the generational trauma might help you make sure it never happens again. You have the power to break this cycle completely. I'm proud of the work you're doing to help other children. Mrs. Morrison told me about the support group and how many children you've helped find their voices. You've turned your pain into purpose, and that gives meaning to the terrible things that happen to you. I hope someday you can find peace, even if you can never forgive me. Your mother, Patricia. The letter revealed layers of family dysfunction that I had never imagined. My father hadn't just been an abuser, he had likely been a victim who became a perpetrator, continuing a cycle of violence that might have gone back generations. But more importantly, the letter confirmed something I had been discovering through my work with other survivors. Abuse thrives in silence and isolation, but it can be defeated when people find the courage to speak truth and take action. I met Paul Henderson during my senior year at Central High School in Louisville. He was a year older captain of the baseball team and planning to study social work at the University of Kentucky. But what drew me to him wasn't his popularity or athletic achievements. It was his genuine kindness and his passionate belief that every child deserved protection and support. I want to work with kids who've had rough starts in life, he told me on our first official date as we walked through Cherokee Park on a crisp autumn afternoon. I think every child deserves at least one adult who believes in them completely and will fight for them when necessary. I knew immediately that I had found someone special, someone whose values aligned perfectly with my own emerging sense of purpose. Paul never pressured me to share my story, but when I finally did during a long conversation on the university campus where he was completing his freshman year, his reaction was everything I could have hoped for. "Mary," he said, stopping our walk to take my hands in his. "Thank you for trusting me with something so personal and painful. What happened to you was terrible beyond words, but look what you've done with that experience. You've turned your trauma into a mission to help other children. You've saved lives with your courage." He paused, looking directly into my eyes with an intensity that made my heart race. "I want you to know that what happened to you doesn't change how I feel about you at all. If anything, it makes me admire you more. You survived something that would have destroyed most people, and you've used that survival to make the world better for other children." We married in June 1972, right after I graduated from the University of Louisville with degrees in psychology and social work. Mrs. Morrison, now retired, but still my mentor and closest friend, walked me down the aisle in the absence of any male relatives I trusted enough to fill that role. The wedding was small but perfect, held in the garden behind Grandma Ruth's bakery, surrounded by friends who had supported me through my healing journey, and colleagues from the various child advocacy organizations where I had been volunteering. As Paul and I exchanged vows, promising to build a life together, based on mutual respect and protection, I thought about the little girl who had once believed she would never escape the yellow house on Maple Street. That girl could never have imagined that love like this was possible, that safety could be taken for granted, that two people could build a partnership based on trust rather than fear. Paul and I built a life together that was everything I had dreamed of during those dark years of abuse. We had 3 children, Sarah in 1975, Michael in 1977, and Rebecca in 1980. Each pregnancy filled me with both joy and terror. Joy at the prospect of bringing new life into the world, terror at the possibility that I might not know how to be a good mother. But Paul reminded me constantly that I had the most important qualification of all. I knew exactly how children should not be treated, and I was fiercely committed to breaking the cycle of abuse that had damaged my family for generations. Our home was filled with laughter, open communication, and unconditional love. We never hit our children, never used fear or intimidation as discipline tools, and always encouraged them to tell us about anything that worried, confused, or frightened them. Remember, I would tell them as I tucked them into bed each night, there is no problem so big that we can't face it together, and no secret so scary that you can't tell mommy or daddy about it. We will always believe you and we will always protect you. I wanted our children to grow up with the kind of security I had never known, the confidence that comes from knowing that the adults in your life will always put your safety and well-being first. In 1982, Paul and I founded the Henderson Payne Foundation for Child Protection, using money we had saved along with donations from community supporters who had heard my story through speaking engagements and media coverage. Our mission was comprehensive: provide support services for abused children, offer education programs for parents and teachers, and advocate for stronger laws protecting children from abuse and neglect. We established safe houses for children awaiting permanent placement-funded therapy programs that specialized in trauma recovery and created educational materials to help adults recognize signs of abuse. We also developed training programs for teachers, coaches, and other adults who worked with children, teaching them how to create environments where children felt safe reporting abuse. One of our most successful programs was Voices of Survival, where adults who had survived childhood abuse shared their stories in schools, community centers, and professional conferences. I was the lead speaker, but we also recruited other survivors who wanted to help break the silence that allowed abuse to flourish. The most important thing we can do, I would tell audiences, is create a culture where children feel safe telling the truth about what's happening to them. Abuse thrives in silence and isolation. It's defeated by voices speaking truth and communities taking action to protect their most vulnerable members. In 1987, I received word that my father was being released from prison after serving his full 15-year sentence. The news brought back nightmares I thought I had conquered and triggered anxiety attacks that reminded me how deep the psychological scars from childhood abuse could run. Against Paul's advice and my own better judgment, I decided to visit him before his release. I needed to see him one final time to close a chapter of my life that had been left unfinished by years of separation and silence. Kentucky State Penitentiary was a gray, forbidding place that seemed designed to crush hope and human dignity. When they brought my father into the visiting room, I barely recognized him. 15 years of imprisonment had aged him dramatically. His thick black hair had turned completely white. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his once powerful body had shrunk to almost frail proportions. But most striking was the change in his eyes. The rage and cruelty that had terrified me as a child were gone, replaced by something that looked like emptiness and defeat. "Mary," he said quietly, settling into the plastic chair across from me and keeping his hands folded on the table between us. "I didn't expect you to come. I wouldn't have blamed you if you never wanted to see me again." "I didn't expect to come either," I replied honestly, studying his face for any sign of the monster who had tortured me for 4 years. "But I needed to see you. I needed to ask you why." For several minutes, we sat in silence, broken only by the sounds of other prisoners visiting with family members, conversations filled with tears, recriminations, and desperate attempts to maintain connections, despite the circumstances that had brought them to this place. Finally, my father spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was hurt the same way when I was a boy. My father used a belt buckle and wooden paddles instead of a broom handle, but the effect was the same. He convinced me that it was normal, that it was how fathers taught their children respect and obedience." He paused, staring down at his hands. "I told myself I would never do that to my children. But when you started growing up and reminding me of myself at that age, something broke inside me. It was like I became him, like his voice was speaking through my mouth, and his hands were moving through mine." "That doesn't excuse what you did to me," I said, firmly, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "No," he agreed immediately. "It doesn't excuse anything. It just explains it. I destroyed your childhood, Mary. I stole your innocence and your sense of safety in the world. I turned your own home into a prison of fear and pain." His voice broke, and I saw tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. "I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix anything, doesn't undo the damage I caused. But I am sorry, Mary. Sorrier than I have words for. Every day for 15 years I've thought about what I did to you, and every day I've wished I could go back and be the father you deserved, instead of the monster I became. I looked at this broken man, who had once been the source of my worst nightmares, and I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. The father who had terrified me was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely tortured by the weight of his own actions. "I forgive you," I said quietly, the words surprising me as much as they seemed to surprise him. He looked up sharply, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You... what?" "I forgive you," I repeated more strongly this time. "Not because you deserve it, and not because it changes what you did. I forgive you because carrying hatred for 23 years has been exhausting, and I'm choosing to let it go. I'm choosing to free myself from the last chains that bind me to what you did." He began to cry, then deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very core of his being, the kind of crying that comes from years of suppressed guilt and shame finally finding release. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he whispered through his tears. "No," I agreed calmly. "You don't. But I'm giving it to you anyway, because that's who I choose to be. That's who I became, despite what you did to me." I left that prison feeling lighter than I had in decades. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about him. It was about freeing myself from the emotional prison I had been carrying around for most of my adult life. It was about choosing healing over hatred, purpose over pain. My relationship with my mother was more complicated and took much longer to resolve. After completing her probation and therapy requirements, she moved back to Kentucky in 1990 and began tentatively reaching out to rebuild some kind of connection with me. Our first meeting in over 25 years took place in a neutral location, a quiet restaurant in downtown Louisville, where we could talk without the emotional weight of familiar surroundings. She had aged dramatically, her auburn hair now completely gray, and her green eyes dulled by years of guilt and psychological treatment. But there was something different about her demeanor, a humility and thoughtfulness that had been absent during my childhood. "Mary?" she said, her voice shaking slightly as we sat across from each other at a small table by the window. "I know I can't undo what I did. I can't give you back the childhood I helped steal from you. But I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was, how completely I failed in my most basic duty as your mother." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "The therapy helped me understand that I wasn't protecting you by participating in the abuse. I was protecting myself from having to confront your father, from having to face my own trauma, from having to risk the stability of what I thought was my family. I was just a child," I said quietly. "I needed you to protect me, and instead, you helped him hurt me." "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I know, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But I want to try to make amends in whatever way I can." Over the following months, we began meeting regularly, cautious conversations that slowly rebuilt some form of relationship. She began volunteering with our foundation, working specifically with mothers who had failed to protect their children from abusive partners. "I can't undo what I did to you," she told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings. "But I can help other mothers find the courage I didn't have. I can help them understand that protecting their children has to come before protecting themselves. Our relationship would never be what a typical mother-daughter relationship should be. Too much damage had been done, too much trust had been broken. But we found a way to work together toward a common goal, channeling our shared pain into efforts to help other families avoid the mistakes that had destroyed ours. She became one of our foundation's most effective counselors because she could speak authentically to the complicated emotions that kept mothers trapped in abusive situations. She understood the fear, the shame, and the twisted logic that convinced women they were protecting their children by failing to protect them. I thought if I could control some aspects of the abuse, make it more predictable, it would be less traumatic for Mary. She would tell groups of mothers who had found themselves in similar situations. I was wrong. There is no way to make child abuse less harmful by participating in it. The only way to protect your children is to remove them from the abusive situation, no matter what the cost to yourself. Tommy, my younger brother, had grown up largely unaware of the full extent of what had happened in our childhood home. He had been placed with our Aunt Margaret after our parents' arrests and had built a relatively normal life as a teacher and coach in Frankfurt. When he learned the complete truth as an adult through newspaper coverage of our foundation's work, he was devastated but also determined to help ensure that other children didn't suffer as I had suffered. Mary, he said during our first adult conversation about our childhood, I had no idea what you went through to protect me. I remember bits and pieces, strange sounds from the basement, you always seeming scared and sad, but I was too young to understand what it meant. He joined our foundation's board of directors and became one of our most passionate advocates for protective services and educational programs. I can't change what happened to my sister, he would tell audiences, but I can make sure that other children in my classroom and my community have adults who are watching out for their safety and well-being. By 2010, the Henderson Payne Foundation had helped more than 800 children escape abusive situations and provided services to over 2,000 families. We had expanded from our original location in Louisville to include offices in Lexington, Frankfurt, Bowling Green, and Paducah, serving families throughout Kentucky. Our Voices of Survival program had reached over 100,000 people through school presentations, community workshops, professional conferences, and media appearances. The statistics showed that communities where we had presented our programs saw significant increases in reports of suspected child abuse, not because abuse was increasing, but because people were finally talking about it and taking action to protect children. One of the children we helped in 1998 was 8-year-old Emma Watson, whose father had been abusing her in ways very similar to what I had experienced. She was the same age I had been when my nightmare began, and helping her felt like reaching back through time to save my younger self. Mrs. Henderson, she said to me after a group session, I had kept my maiden name professionally to honor my grandmother and my own survival. Will the bad feelings ever go away? I knelt down to look her in the eyes, the same way Mrs. Morrison had done for me so many years ago, and saw my own childhood fear and hope reflected in her face. Emma, I said, the bad feelings will get smaller and smaller until they don't control your life anymore. They might never go away completely, but they'll become manageable. And someday, when you're all grown up, you might decide to help other little girls who are going through what you're going through now. That's how we turn our hurt into healing, our pain into purpose. Emma is now a social worker in Nashville specializing in child protection cases. She credits that conversation with helping her see a future beyond her trauma and inspiring her to dedicate her career to helping other survivors. As I write this memoir at age 71, I am surrounded by the love and purpose I once thought was impossible for someone like me. Paul and I celebrated our 48th wedding anniversary last year, surrounded by our 3 children, 9 grandchildren, and dozens of friends and colleagues from the foundation. Our oldest daughter, Sarah, followed in our footsteps and became a child psychologist who specializes in trauma therapy. Our son, Michael, became a prosecutor, focusing on crimes against children, inspired by his understanding of how the legal system can either protect or fail vulnerable children. Our youngest, Rebecca, became a teacher directly inspired by Mrs. Morrison's example of how one caring adult can change a child's entire future trajectory. The small yellow house where my nightmare began was torn down in 1998 to make room for a community park dedicated to child safety and family support. I attended the demolition watching as the walls that had contained so much pain and terror were reduced to rubble and hauled away. But the apple orchard behind the house was preserved and incorporated into the park design. Those trees, now fully mature and producing abundant fruit that feeds hungry families through our Foundation's community programs, have been transformed from witnesses to my suffering into symbols of growth, renewal, and hope. Mrs. Morrison lived to be 95 years old, remaining active in child advocacy work until just months before her death in 2019. I spoke at her funeral, telling the hundreds of people in attendance about how she had saved my life by simply choosing to see a child who was hurting and taking action to help. Linda Morrison taught me that healing is possible. I said, looking out at an audience that included dozens of former students whose lives she had touched, that love is stronger than fear and that one person's courage to speak truth can change everything. She didn't just save one 12-year-old girl in 1964, she saved everyone that girl would go on to help throughout her lifetime. The Foundation continues to grow and evolve under the leadership of our children and a new generation of advocates who understand that protecting children requires constant vigilance and ongoing commitment. We now have partnerships with schools in 22 states, and our educational materials have been translated into 8 languages to reach more diverse communities. But the work that means the most to me is still the one-on-one conversations with children who are living in the kind of hell I once knew. When I look into their frightened eyes and tell them, "You are not alone, you are not at fault, and there are people who will believe you and help you," I am completing a circle that began with Mrs. Morrison's kindness to a scared 12-year-old girl more than 50 years ago. If you are reading this story, and you are a child who is being hurt by someone you should be able to trust, I want you to know several important things. First, it is absolutely not your fault. Nothing you did or didn't do, nothing you said or didn't say, nothing about who you are or how you behave caused this to happen to you. The adult who is hurting you is completely responsible for their actions, and you are completely innocent of any wrongdoing. Second, there are people who will believe you and help you. Look for teachers like Mrs. Morrison, school counselors, nurses, coaches, librarians, or other trusted adults who treat children with respect and kindness. It might take courage to speak up, and it might take more than one conversation, but that courage can literally save your life and change your future completely. Third, surviving trauma doesn't mean you are broken forever or damaged beyond repair. With help, support, and time, you can heal from even the worst experiences. You can build a beautiful, meaningful life filled with love, purpose, and joy. I am living proof of that possibility, and so are hundreds of other survivors who have found their way from victimization to empowerment. And finally, your pain can become your purpose. The experiences that nearly destroyed you can become the foundation for helping others, for making sure that other children don't have to suffer as you have suffered. My worst nightmare became the source of my greatest mission and deepest satisfaction in life. To the adults reading this story, be like Mrs. Morrison. Pay attention to the children around you in your family, your neighborhood, your workplace, your community. Ask direct questions when you see signs of distress or fear. Believe children when they tell you someone is hurting them, even if it's hard to accept or inconvenient to address. Report suspected abuse to the proper authorities, even if you're not completely certain what you're seeing. It's better to make a report that turns out to be unfounded than to stay silent while a child continues to suffer. Create environments where children feel safe expressing their fears and concerns. Let them know that they can come to you with any problem, no matter how big or scary it seems to them. Child abuse thrives in silence, isolation, and communities that choose not to see what's happening to their most vulnerable members. It is defeated by voices speaking truth, adults taking action, and societies that prioritize the protection of children above all other considerations. My name is Mary Payne Henderson, and I am a survivor. More importantly, I am living proof that survival is just the beginning of what's possible. Beyond survival lies healing, beyond healing lies purpose, and beyond purpose lies the incredible power to transform tragedy into hope, pain into protection, and personal trauma into community healing. The broken broom that was once used to torture me became evidence that set me free and brought my abusers to justice. Your story of pain can become your story of power and purpose, too. You are stronger than you know, braver than you feel, and more loved than you can possibly imagine. Your future is waiting for you to claim it, and there are people ready to help you build the life you deserve. Never give up. Never stop believing that change is possible. Never let anyone convince you that you have to accept abuse as normal or inevitable. You matter. Your safety matters. Your future matters. And most importantly, you are not alone.